But let's take another example of what's happening behind these numbers of benefit incidents, and why is it that we have different numbers of benefit incidents for each case. Well, the first column here says in these case areas what percentage of poor households are actually connected. The first thing you see is that there's a big difference between Bangalore, for example, and Bogota in terms of the coverage amongst the poor. So Bogota has less of what I called before the access handicap. Most poor households should be eligible for this subsidy in the case of Bogota. Whereas in Bangalore, no matter how good a subsidy we design, as long as it's a consumption subsidy, no more than 39.5% of poor households would ever even be eligible. That's a big hit to this subsidy before we even start to deliver it. The next column says, of the connected poor, so those are those who would be eligible for the subsidy, what percentage of them are actually getting the subsidy? They're targeted for the subsidy and they're receiving it. Bangalore, in these two examples, everyone gets a subsidy. So targeting is not excluding anyone in Bangalore. It's just a problem of access and connections. Look at Paraguay, though, on the other hand. Remember that this was the increasing block tariff that looked like it was doing a better job of reaching the poor. But you see that almost all of poor households are actually excluded. Remember, the increasing block tariff was for 5 cubic meters or for 15 cubic meters. A lot of poor households, the vast majority of poor households in this case, are consuming much more than that. So there are very, very few poor households that actually qualify. There may be more poor households that qualify than non-poor households, but still, less than 10% in both cases of poor households are actually receiving this subsidy. In Bogota, we have an increasing block tariff with geographic targeting. And here, as we said, almost all poor households are connected. It's also very close to a general subsidy, so almost all of those who are eligible are actually getting the subsidy. In Chile, though, high coverage again, but of those who are connected, only 23% are actually getting the subsidy. Now, why is this? It must be something to do with the means testing, that some households, despite the means test, are excluded. There's also something about this Chile subsidy that makes sure that the subsidy is spread across the country. So because of that budgeting aspect of the subsidy, some households are excluded. So only 23% of the connected poor in Chile actually get the subsidy. And in Kathmandu, slum discount, about half of the connected poor are actually getting the subsidy in this case. Half of the connected poor live in slum areas, in other words. So the final column is what percentage of poor households are actually receiving these subsidies. And so we see, again, Bangalore, 39.5%, Paraguay, very, very low. It may look good in terms of the distribution of the subsidy pie between poor and non-poor, but very, very few poor households actually are benefited by this particular subsidy. In Bogota, almost all poor households get the subsidy. In Chile, about less than 20% of poor households are getting this subsidy, and in Kathmandu, the slum discount, about a quarter of the households are getting the subsidy. What have we learned then from all of this? We learned that the benefit incidence of a subsidy is determined both by who receives the subsidy and also what size the subsidy is. So if we're trying to understand or we're trying to design a subsidy, we want to ask a few very important questions. The first one is, are the poor eligible to receive the subsidy? And in doing that, we need to consider access to the network as well as connections. Are the poor targeted by the subsidy? In addition to that, in addition to the targeting mechanism, we also want to consider for connection subsidies, will poor households actually connect if they're offered a connection subsidy? And for some consumption subsidies, we need to consider meters, if you need a meter to deliver the subsidy. And finally, what size of subsidy do the different households receive? those factors put together determine the benefit incidence of a subsidy. And unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, the benefit incidence of water subsidies is very regressive, certainly in the case of increasing block tariffs with general price discounts for all residential customers. But even in the case of some of the other means-tested and geographically targeted subsidies. Those that do have a higher benefit incidence often achieve it at the expense of excluding many poor households, which means that we may do a good job of directing subsidies to the poor, but many poor households may still be excluded. Thank you.